Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our three speakers. Doug Henwood is our moderator, and he is an economic journalist and broadcaster, author of Wall Street, How It Works and For Whom, and host of Behind the News, a weekly radio show on economics and politics. His current obsession is the U.S. ruling class, a rocky social formation. Phillips-Fein is a professor of history at Columbia who specializes in 20th century American politics and political economy. She has a review essay on private equity in the October 19th issue of the New York Review of Books. Her most recent book is Fear City, New York's Fiscal Crisis and the Rise of Austerity Politics, essential reading for everyone. And Holden Taylor is a tenant organizer and writer who teaches in the CUNY system. They are a founding member of the Brooklyn Eviction Defense Tenant Union, a member of the Crown Heights Tenant Union, author of the recent Cosmonaut article, The Protagonism of Tenants, also essential reading. Their academic work focuses on tenancy, housing financialization, political economy, and growth theory. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to give some overview remarks here, and then get down there to proceed. You've always got to start somewhere, so I'm going to start at the 19th century was turning to the 20th. As the scale and complexity of production increased, the previously existing world of businesses that are run either as sole proprietorships or small partnerships were inadequate to the test. They gave way to what would become the large professionally managed corporations, many of them assembled from smaller pieces by the likes of J.P. Morgan. Morgan hated competition as a destructive force, and while his preference for private monopolies controlled by the likes of him is not our social ideal, neither should we romanticize the old world of small competitive firms. Competition has never been a socialist virtue. These new large firms are marked by what later would be called the separation of ownership and control. The official owners were outside investors, stockholders, who could sell those shares to other investors if they liked, but had little influence over corporate policy. That was set by the increasingly professionalized cast of formally trained managers. The first U.S. business school, Wharton, was founded in 1881, and over the next couple of decades, many others sprang to life, including Harvard's in 1908. At the same time, stock markets grew enormously in size and importance, and financial operators played a big role in manipulating corporations, a big role in corporate governance, how firms are run, and for whom. With the crash in 29, the financial operators who manipulated and cheated their way through the roaring 20s were beaten back, and their freedom to maneuver greatly hobbled first by shame and then by the regulatory reforms in the 1930s. Legal scholars and economists began reflecting on what it meant that shareholders were now mostly millions of dispersed individuals, concentrated among the affluent, of course, but incapable of communicating with each other about the companies they owned. And the left managers largely free to run the firms. Sure, dissatisfied shareholders could sell stock, but they had no leverage over their hired managerial tenants. That began to change in the 1970s, but at the same time, institutional investors like pension funds replaced individual as major stockholders, and corporate performance at the same time deteriorated with the stagflation of the 1970s. In the early post-World War II decades, profits, dividends, and share prices rose more or less reliably. That was no longer true by the mid-1970s. The major financial markets had one of their most miserable decades of history. And those institutional stock owners were roused to action, led by the buyout artists who would later become the commanders of the shareholder revolution. Their organizing revolutionary doctrine of getting profits up and therefore stock prices is the only point of business enterprise. All notions of responsibility and stakeholdership should be junked in favor of pure profit maximization. The roots of modern private equity were in the early post-World War II years, but things didn't really get rolling for a few more decades. In the lead were the trio Jerome Kohlberg, Henry Kravis, and George Roberts, Henry's cousin. They were working at the investment firm Bear Stearns in the mid-1960s. They started small, doing debt-financed buyouts of family-owned companies in the 1960s and 70s. The trio founded their own eponymous firm, Kohlberg, Kravis, Roberts, in 1976. Many others soon followed. KKR would become one of the giants of private equity. Kohlberg died in 2015, but Kravis and Roberts are still running the operation. At first, the buyout deals engineered by the young KKR and his early colleagues were small and financially sensible. But as the roaring 80s got going, the deals and the loans that financed them got bigger. The archetypal deal of the decade was called a leveraged buyout, or OBO, which inspired the newsletter I read in 1986. LBOs involved borrowing lots of money to take over companies, then cutting costs sharply, and offloading the property a few years later by going public again, or selling to someone else, like another buyout BP, or the public through a stock offering. The LBO's movement's principal mode of funding was junk bonds, high interest rate debt, most famously associated with the rogue brokerage Drexel Burnham Lambert, run from an X-shaped desk in Beverly Hills by Michael Milken, who later went to jail for securities fraud. Milken assembled a coterie of buyout artists armed with money he could raise in an instant from his investor circle, and for a decade they wilded their way across the corporate landscape. The decade saw over 2,000 LBOs worth $250 billion. Many of them were hostile takeovers, meaning unwelcomed by management of the target firms. It was quite an episode of intra-class warfare, as stodgy old-line CEOs were attacked by takeover artists and displaced. Along with KKR and the gang, raiders like Boone Pickens and Carl Icahn became household names, at least in households that get the Wall Street Journal home delivered. There's a theory behind all the terms. Its chief proponent was Michael Jensen, a professor at the Harvard Business School, who wrote a series of papers arguing that corporate management was wasting money that should instead be going to shareholders, who in Jensen's worldview were paramount for undisclosed reasons. They were wasting those things on things like perks, but also employment. The ideal, he argued, was a world in which alternative managerial teams compete for rights to manage corporate resources. Corporations should not be stable institutions in the Jensen vision, but instead exist in a state of capitalist permanent revolution. Managers, Jensen argued, should be paid principally in stock, so they'd think and act like shareholders, instead of being paid fixed salaries as they were in the good old days. And he further counseled, loading up firms with debt would serve as an excellent disciplinary device. Having to cover the interest bill would force the closure or sale of weaker divisions and cost cutting in the survivors. The mania of the 80s is usually said to have kicked off with the 1982 buyout of Gibson Greeting Card, a deal led by former Treasury Secretary and political reactionary William Simon. The investors kicked in about $1 million of their own money out of a total purchase price of $80 million. Less than a year and a half later, Gibson went public by splitting $290 million worth of stock, more than that, over 3 times the original investment, and Simon made personally $60 million out of the deal. This success inspired many imitations. The mania peaked with KKR's 1989 buyout of RJR Nabisco, now universally seen as a debacle. The company was sold off piece by piece and ceased to exist. A decade later, 2,000 workers lost their jobs. RJR's fall was emblematic of the end of the roaring 80s. Hundreds of firms found themselves unable to service their debts. Embarrassed, they used to say in the 19th century. Bankruptcies replaced buyouts in the headlines, and Drexel got put out of business by the government. But the turmoil had a lasting effect on class relations. The challenge of servicing large debts meant firms had to hammer away at costs. And for most firms, their major cost was labor. Wage cutting and mass layoffs hammered working class living standards and self-confidence. For the dwindling number of workers in unions, concessions became the norm, and workers were often grateful to have a job at all. That differential reflex persisted for decades and may only now be lifted. At the top, the shareholder revolution transformed executive pay. Jensen's dream of having CEOs paid in stock was largely realized, and the antagonism that characterized financial market executive relations in the 1980s was resolved largely on financial terms. Private equity began reviving in the early 1990s hangover, newly respectable, no longer associated with unsavory takeover artists and felonious investment banking. And CEOs with their hearts in the stock price often welcomed takeover offers instead of rejecting it. PE entered another winter in the early 2000s after the collapse of the late 1990s tech bubble, only to rise again. Deals got huger and huger, and big PE firms like Blackstone, TBG, and Carlyle were all over it. An innovation of the period was PE firms going public by selling stock in small partnerships of just a small group of people. They sold stock to the public And notably, Blackstone led the way in 2007. At the time, I wrote in The Nation that the timing suggested the great bubble of that decade was about to pop, because Blackstone guys are clever. And the great financial crisis was underway just months after Blackstone got off its stock offering. Blackstone, though, was careful to keep all the voting rights for itself and took the first cuts of profits and decided what the shareholders could have. The shareholders having their say in it. A number of other PE firms followed. For them, it was like free money. The early 1990s were a time of relative calm financially. The economy was in what some in Wall Street called the contained depression, which they thought was a good thing, since it meant the Fed would keep interest rates low and credit easy. The hard money Wall Street in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when Paul Volcker drove up interest rates towards 20% to break inflation, was giving way to a Wall Street that loved a generous Fed, since it raised asset values and made it easier to borrow. By the middle of the next decade, the old LBO movement was reborn as private equity. PE stumbled some during the Great Recession, following the 2008 financial crisis, and then boom, as the Fed, led by PE alum Jay Powell, printed money in large quantities. It stumbled again during the COVID spill, but then soared again along with everything else, from Bitcoin to Nikes. Higher interest rates and tighter financial conditions have slowed the PE juggernaut down over the last year or so, but these guys do have a habit of shrugging off adversity. Today, a typical private equity firm is managed by a smallish staff that uses money contributed by institutional investors, like pension funds and university endowments, to buy up whole companies. They're a worldwide phenomenon, but their spiritual home is in the US, as is the bulk of their money. Typically, they run the firms they own for a few years, cutting costs and rearranging their components, and then selling them either to the public in a stock offering or to another private equity firm. Also, typically, PE operators load the firms they own up with debt to pay themselves fat fees and dividends. These are not meant to be long-term relationships. The idea is to contribute as little as possible, extract as much as possible, and exit the firm a few years later. And the fees, the typical structure of private equities is that they charge 2% of the assets under management and 20% of the profits. That's 2 and 20 in shorthand, plus whatever they can extract from the portfolio companies as in the form of fees and dividends. Top executive pay at PE for enterprises is very tax favored. Attempts to move that tax break will always collapse. PE has become a major presence in the U.S. economic landscape. According to the industry's trade association, the American Investment Council, 12 million people work at 32,000 PE-owned companies. That's about 8% of the total workforce. The appeal for outside investors in private equity firms is that they supposedly offer higher returns than the public stock markets. But the evidence for this proposition is shaky. In fact, it's hard to argue that when taking risk into account, that the high fees produce better returns than what's offered by a Vanguard index fund with fees close to zero. Some of the big names in the field include Blackstone, the Carlyle Group, DC-based unusually, with deep associations with the federal government and the national security state, TBG Incorporated, Silver Lake, and Bain, which is what made Mitt Romney rich. Let's take a quick look at Blackstone. Blackstone was founded in 1985 by Pete Peterson, now dead, and Steve Schwarzman, now number 34 in the Bloomberg billionaires list, worth, if you can call it that, $38 billion. They've been the biggest player in private equity for most recent years, so occasionally KKR overtakes them in the ranking. They trade them 1 and 2 position fairly regularly. It's back on top in 2023. Along with private equity, Blackstone also has real estate and hedge fund divisions. It has a total of $1 trillion under management. About a third of it in the private equity division. Just 250 people work in the PE segment, which works out to $1.2 billion of capital to allocate per employee. New investments over the year ending in June were about $29 billion, and proceeds from the sales of the company came to about $24 billion. The numbers taken together, they suggest a whole lot of turnover. They buy and sell companies like crazy. For top management, the game is very lucrative. Last year, Schwarzman's pay was $1.25 billion. Among the companies it owns, Emerson Climate Technologies, Ancestry.com, Mumble, and Reese Witherspoon's Hello Sunshine. Well, all of those. That's kind of the front page of the website. Over the last couple of decades, PE has left a pile of corporate corpses in its wake. Some of the highest profile victims have been in retail. Many shopping mall stalwarts have disappeared over the last decade or two, most notoriously Toys R Us, were driven under by PE's depredation. You could argue that the decline of brick and mortar retail meant these stores were doomed anyway, but it's not clear why vulture investors should drink their last drops of blood rather than the workers. PE firms are very active in the nursing home sector, a sector that was already dominated by thin staffing and low wages. PE means thinner and lower. Dentistry chains are another popular target. They're encouraging pointless root canals to boost the cash flow. Finally, a couple of sociological notes on the growth of private equity. Liza Featherstone, and I did a piece in these Times a few years ago, showing how deeply invested public pension funds are in private equity. And many unions are happy to play along, and not only in the US. The Ontario Teachers Fund is a notorious partner of PE firms around the world. They're in search of higher returns, but as I said earlier, management fees eat up most of the notional gains. The PE strategy is deeply anti-worker. Cutting labor costs is central to any debt extraction strategy. Interest and fees must be paid. Pension fund investment in PE has a long history. Back in the early 80s, when KKR was first getting started, it was desperate to legitimate itself with big institutional investors. It got the seal of approval from the Oregon State Pension Board. Other funds soon followed it. As KKR's George Roberts told the Oregon Board in 2013, you all are our longest standing partner. We always start with you. Given that these funds are managed in the name of workers, this really is class treason. PE is a fitting symbol for a bourgeoisie that has lost any sense of mission. In the last Gilded Age, in the late 19th century, rampaging capitalists like Carnegie built libraries and Rockefeller built cathedrals and universities. Now our shallow and ludicrous titans use their riches to shoot themselves into space. They seem not to think that they need to legitimate themselves with public philanthropy, that their money is just enough to legitimate. PE's strategy of asset stripping is an extreme example, but rates of net investment, net that is of depreciation, which is accounting's way of measuring decay, in both the private and public sectors right now is very low. Contrary to the worry awards, profit rates have long recovered from the 1970s lows, and the capitalist class is rolling in money. This financial branch is claiming more and more of the corporate surplus for itself, thanks in no small part to the practice of corporations buying their own stock to boost its price, one of the durable legacies of the shareholder revolution. And the rightward move of the Republican Party has been greatly lubricated by the increasing wealth and political engagement of private actors. PE titans like Schwartzman, but also the owners of private companies like Charles Koch and Fiscal. Schwartzman was an economic advisor to Trump, whatever that means, and was one of his last respectable business people to break with him. Travis is a more establishment style Republican, but he was not above giving $1 million Trump's inaugural dividend. Trump's own business style was not unlike that of PE. He ran a real estate firm with a small staff and no outside shareholders. Like a private equity guy, Trump loaded up his casinos with debt and pocketed much of the proceeds of the loans. That's what happened with his Atlantic City casinos. It's pretty hard to lose money in that business, but Trump's all went bankrupt. He did fine. What unites these guys, the PE natives, the Koch circle, is that they don't want to answer to anyone or anything other than their own money. No outside shareholders, and certainly the government. This is all of great political importance, but there's also something of theoretical interest here too. Over the last few decades, we've seen a sharp decline in the number of listed companies, those whose stock trades at public markets, alongside the rise of fully private firms. Marx described the emergence of the joint stock company with its separation of ownership and management as the abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself. That process now looks to be thrown into reverse. The modest gains in transparency and accountability that have come with the public corporation and its disclosure requirements are being junked in favor of opacity and unchecked false power. I suppose this is appropriate to a period of reaction, but it doesn't sound like a good development. Thanks.
Yeah, and so I'll go next. So thank you. First of all, thank you so much to Alice and Carrington and Doug and Holden also for organizing and inviting me today. And I guess I wanted to start out by saying that I come at this maybe a little bit like many of you. I'm not really a kind of scholar of finance, and actually, so I appreciate especially Doug's remarks there, which I hope you'll kind of put out or publish in some form. They're tremendously helpful, and just very it's remarkable how much is written about private equity that is really difficult and opaque and doesn't give a sense of the history and the importance of this development. So it's actually really tremendously helpful. So I come at this, I think the main reason I'm here today is that I wrote a essay, which was drawing on two books, which I also will just mention, but one is by a federal prosecutor actually named Brendan Ballou, who that book is called Plunder. And the other book is by the financial journalist Gretchen Morgenstern, and it's called These Are the Plunderers. So both of these two different books both hit on plunder to talk about private equity. But in some ways, they both are, both books have a lot that's interesting in them, but they're very focused on a sort of sensationalistic description of the industry. And thus, I felt in some ways Doug's comments are actually more useful. Anyway, I think that I guess I would emphasize or underline a couple of the points that Doug raised. I imagine that many people are here because private equity is often invoked, but what is it? How do we understand what is this thing? Private equity suddenly seems to be everywhere. Where did it come from, and what is it doing? How does it work that's different from how capitalism usually operates? And I think one thing that's notable about private equity is that it actually distills many elements of contemporary capitalism. It's not totally set apart from them, but kind of brings them to a fine point in a sense. So private equity, as Doug described, really is a way, I think it's helpful to think of it as a way of organizing corporate ownership and driving management practices. And essentially what private equity funds are pools of money managed by professionals that promise to earn high returns through a particular set of business practices. I think it's important to note that they are not as extensively regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission as publicly traded corporations. And the SEC actually expanded its regulation of private equity. You may know more about this, Doug, at the end of the summer. But my understanding is that really prior to those regulations adopted in August, which the industry is challenging legally, private equity funds really had to tell investors, let alone the general public, very, very little about what they were actually doing. So in contrast to other kinds of investment funds that will take investors' money and put it into the stock market and manage it in order to generate high returns, hopefully, for the investors, or hedge funds, which are trying to exploit price differences between different stocks or different assets, private equity companies are trying to take investor money. You need to have a lot of money usually to invest in these firms. You usually can't just do it with a small amount. You have to have a lot to buy in. They take the companies, then they buy up all the stock, they make them private for a period of time, and then they sell them again, hopefully from their perspective, at a very large profit. They promise huge returns, and some have earned a lot of money. But again, as Doug pointed out, the returns, if you look a little bit at the literature on this, their returns are much more scattershot than they say. So even, again, forget about the rest of us, but from the standpoint of the investors, it's not clear that they deliver on what they say they will. The sector has grown, and as Doug said, very rapidly in recent years. And it looks like, especially since 2008, there's been a big influx of money into this, so that now more companies are owned by private equity funds that are traded on the stock exchange. And again, more than about 12 million people work for companies that are owned by private equity. Again, like, and the companies, and this is, again, it's kind of transitory because the private equity funds are holding the companies for a while with some intention of then selling them again. So it's not a permanent arrangement, but the idea is that they're going to hold these companies and then sell them. Many companies, a bizarre array of companies have been so purchased. We've mentioned Toys R Us, Dunkin' Donuts has been owned by private equity. Many medical practices, dental practices, veterinary companies, nursing homes, the companies that collect calls for prisoners, a whole huge array of companies have been taken over by these private equity firms. But, and I think in contrast, the investors have included both wealthy individuals, but also pension funds and university endowments. I think those have also been very important. The kind of underscoring something else Doug brought up, the respectability of this set of practices. During the 80s, these were viewed as risky, a little uncomfortable. There was a substantial amount, the movie Wall Street, there's a strong sense that what these funds were doing, what the leveraged buyout operators were doing was problematic. Today, it's really central and respectable. And the role of university endowments and the pension funds has probably been key in bringing that about. Finally, I think this one last point is the role of debt in making this happen, that the companies also promise to make money through borrowing and then using that debt to pressure the companies that they buy to pay, to make a set of management changes very quickly to pay them the debt. Now, there's a question, why should the returns from, in terms of their own self-explanation, why should these funds be able to generate such high returns? And I think the way they explain it is partly there's a mystique around ownership, that ownership gives them a direct interest in the company in a way that the anonymous, distant, remote shareholders and the corporate bureaucrats who are CEOs don't have. And that somehow by fusing together ownership and control, they create a supercharged and motivated set of owners who will carefully analyze everything and look at it and understand the industry and bring it, just invest all of their passion into it, and that will make the companies more profitable. In practice, of course, this is not really how they work at all. For one thing, the private equity funds are very different from the image of the small entrepreneur. They are kind of more like mid-century conglomerates. They just own so many different companies. They cannot possibly have any intimate understanding or knowledge of how those companies work. They are a strange and kind of technocratic, for all of their kind of investment in the ideology of ownership, they're actually these very technocratic and remote operations. And usually, from what we can see, many of the ways that they try to generate returns are first through this very intense pressure on the companies themselves. On average, companies bought by private equity see the workforce shrink by about 4%. So they tend to lay people off or in other ways rationalize and limit the number of people working for the company. They also kind of compel the companies that they own to engage in a variety of business practices that might appear irrational if your goal was to build a functional company. So, for example, there are many nursing home companies or hospitals that have been forced to sell the buildings or the real estate upon which they are located. And that brings a lot of money in that you can then use to pay off debt. But it leaves the nursing home or the hospital or whatever it is having to pay rent for things that once it had cost, it had once controlled in-house. So from the standpoint of the management of that, from the standpoint of management of the actual enterprise, it doesn't make any sense from the standpoint of the private equity fund, it's just an income stream coming in. There are also many examples. The private equity funds basically compel the establishments that they control to pay them large amounts of money for advice and management in a way that you would not normally. Different divisions of a single corporation would not do that. They wouldn't just transfer fees from one part to the other, but that's what the private equity funds are able to do. Many companies go bankrupt under this pressure, again, suggesting that it's not rational from the standpoint of the individual unit or let alone the actual service that the company is supposed to be providing. And this is all on top of course, the companies are pressured to cut costs in many ways. Nursing homes compelled to cut staff, medical practices forced to scrimp on new supplies. There are many examples of people, especially in smaller medical practices, who are very unhappy about being purchased by private equity funds because they know that they won't be able to deliver the same kind of services to patients that they previously had. So I think that, I guess what is really striking about this whole process is the ways that that private equity seems to operate. There's something about it which is it feels very economically irrational from the standpoint of producing or creating or generating even profits for the economic enterprises themselves. And I think that was what was most striking to me in reading these books. 100 years ago, or just thinking back to the capitalist dynasties of the late 19th and early 20th century, those were dynasties, and Marx wrote about this as well, that were on the one hand exploitative, but on the other hand productive, that they generated a economic and material order that was capable of producing phenomenal amounts of material wealth. And what is really remarkable about this form of ownership is that it seems to cut that off, or like it is no longer constructive of anything. It's a set of practices that work in the opposite way. And I think this speaks to or thinking again, like of the mid 20th century capitalism, or capitalism during the Cold War, that was a more defensive in some ways and more socialized version of capitalism that had to defend itself against some broad challenge from an alternate social and economic order. And it's those processes that seem to be being reversed in important ways today. The result is a social and economic elite that is cut off in important ways from the rest of the society and seems to be insulated in a kind of extreme and narcissistic privilege that makes it basically incapable of addressing serious social problems, everything from climate change to questions about national foreign policy and security, again, even conceived in very narrow terms of US interests. This elite seems like it has great difficulty acting together or coherently. So private equity is not alone in driving this change, but there's something about it that seems to embody perfectly some of the broader tensions and contradictions and challenges of the current moment. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Holden.
Well, thank you to both y'all. Both of those talks are excellent, super informative. My name's Holden. I'm mostly a tenant organizer, so a lot of my thinking here about private equity and housing comes from that sort of perspective. What I'm going to talk about broadly is about how the 2008 financial and foreclosure crisis, sort of how that changed how private equity operates in New York City and sort of shaped the wider American housing landscape. And then also going to talk specifically about what private equity and more broadly, like financialization of housing means for tenancy in New York City. But before getting into that, two notes. The first is just emphasizing that housing, home, and land have always in class societies been sites of class struggle. I want to put forth my tenant union, which is the Brooklyn Eviction Defense Tenant Union in Brooklyn. Shout out. Our theorization of what we call the worker tenant, and more broadly worker tenancy. This is a sort of class analysis that connects the exploitation of labor with the expropriation or dispossession of tenancy. And sort of a lot of my thinking about financialization of housing comes through this lens. And the second note, which is just a general thesis, is that private equity's effect in housing and the financialization of housing more broadly, sort of like Kim was saying, acts as a catalyst. It concentrates and disseminates and also permits practices and applies like a homogenizing sort of blanket pressure onto tenants. And like Doug was saying in terms of class treason, this concentration and this catalyst needs to be understood in terms of class and class struggle. So we need to understand that that concentration, the coerced class treason that Doug was referencing, that is a class domination tool of capital and landed capital. Okay, so housing financialization and private equity's role in housing. I think we start with 1960 when Congress passes legislation to establish what's called the Real Estate Investment Trust legal form. And so a real estate investment trust are pooled investments, sort of analogous to mutual funds. They invest money into a diverse array of real estate that they own. And really importantly, their payouts to the investors, to the shareholders essentially, are tax exempt. So essentially, real estate investment trusts pay no corporate tax. So that was important, established in 1960, but it wasn't really until the 1990s, the early 1990s, when they really started to assume prominence. And ever since then, the proportion of real estate and specifically rental real estate in the hands of corporations, real estate trusts, and private equity has just consistently increased. And then right before and in the fallout of the 2008 foreclosure crisis, this really accelerated. And I think 2008 is really a sort of hallmark moment in how we understand all of this. Quick numbers, 38% of multifamily units in the country as of 2021. And a caveat about all of ownership conversations around real estate, really, really hard to know who actually owns anything. They're great resources, but like these numbers, I don't know if we can really trust them that much, but they're rough and they help. 38% of multifamily units, so that's like actual big apartment buildings, owned by individual investors, 42% by corporate entities. Private equity is now the dominant form of financial backing among the 35 largest owners of multifamily buildings. And so the 2008 housing crisis, financial crisis, whatever you want to call it, really hallmark. And I don't want to get too deep into the weeds with this because people could talk about it for hours. But one of the driving forces of the financial crisis was the sort of housing bubble and the concomitant mortgage-backed security frenzy. And mortgage-backed securities are, what happens is people take out mortgages to be able to pay for capital-intensive use values like a home. And the banks that give out those mortgages then sell them, which financial firms package. And they're really attractive to financial firms because they represent recurrent income of mortgage payments. And so you can securitize those, package them, cut them up, and then speculate upon them. And what happens was these mortgage-backed securities became so enticing to big financial firms that banks and other firms and like became incredibly interested in just pumping out mortgages. So we see the subprime mortgage crisis, predatory mortgages, and it's really interesting. And I think one of the more interesting conceptualizations of this is So with the extension of subprime mortgages, what we see is demographics in America that historically have been excluded from home ownership are suddenly included. And so for like a very moment within the housing bubble, we kind of see like this American ideal briefly, precariously realized, but then with the crash, we see millions of foreclosures on these new homeowners. And I really think we can understand this in one register as like the closing of the American frontier. If we understand the American frontier as this like endless valve that like allows for otherwise sort of resistant or rebellious energy to sort of be funneled towards the stream or ideal of in like small shareholder land ownership. I think in 2008 we really see that ideal, that promise evaporate. So we see millions of single family homes that were previously owner occupied foreclosed upon, and what happens is private equity and other big financial firms come in, buy up a shit ton of these single family homes, and instead of flipping them, because after seeing how enticing the sort of securitizable income of a mortgage was, these financial firms transform these single family homes into rentals. So we see like a really marked shift of owner occupied homes into single family rentals. And this is what Desiree Fields, who's a really brilliant geographer at UC Berkeley, calls the creation of a new asset class. And this is like Blackstone, like Doug was talking about, and Invitation Homes come in and start buying up mass amounts of single family homes. And that's kind of like the shifting landscape broadly in this country. New York City is a little bit different because private equity really starts coming into New York City before the 2008 crisis. Private equity starts buying up rent stabilized multifamily apartment complexes all over New York City. And this is within the sort of housing bubble. So they're buying these, and not only is there at this point in time lax deregulation oversight, so like they're buying these with increasing like building values, like the building values are just skyrocketing, and also they're finding out that they can deregulate these buildings like nothing. But what happens with the 2008 financial crisis is that a lot of these private equity firms go under, and so then suddenly you see tenants all over New York City who don't have landlords anymore, or whose landlords are like maybe a bank, but these foreclosure processes take a long time. And so you see a lot of tenants, particularly in the Bronx, but all over New York City, left in this weird limbo where their buildings are unowned and they don't get any repairs done. They have no one really to complain to. But then on the flip side, private equity firms that stay alive through this time, they have big losses. So to recoup these losses, they really double down on deregulation. And the way to deregulate buildings in New York City at this time was very simple. You push people out, and then you can like do all sorts of shady shit when no one's in the apartment. And this happened in mass. But what was really important, and I think for tenant organizers and the tenant movement, a hallmark moment here was that there was this sort of narrative struggle that emerged. So this term predatory equity started picking up a lot of purchase in tenant organizing in New York City. Different tenant organizations all over New York City started using this term to describe these private equity firms that, like Kim was saying, because of this big saddle of debt, were compelled even more ferociously to push tenants out. And while it was really incredibly fucked up, and like hundreds of thousands of rent stabilized units were deregulated, I do think the tenant movement's like ability to sort of construct this shared narrative really became a sort of unifying force. And I think did a lot to sort of cohere the tenant movement. And we'll see in a second how that coherence has sort of pushed towards some wins. But, oh yeah. Okay, and so the one thing to say is like predatory equity at this time was really bad, of course, but what's really, really important is that the actions and practices of private equity, like the way they got people out and the way that they managed rental units, spread like wildfire. So all of a sudden, landlords of all shapes and sizes mom and pops, the landlord who lives above you, all of a sudden they were all doing the same kind of shit. And so I think like Kim was saying, it's a distillation of sort of capitalist logics, and it's also like a viral sort of effect. And I think the things we see here, the first one that I'm sure everyone is familiar with is the establishment of shell companies. So my landlord is technically called 930 LLC. Even though I know who it is, his name is Seth Miller. We beat him in court this summer. So and so with that comes a lot of secrecy, liability protection. A lot of tenants in the tenant union have to wage a big struggle just to find out who their landlord is. And then on top of that, kind of like both what Doug and Kim are saying, a really intense practice of shedding unnecessary or costly maintenance. So something in the tenant union we see a lot is just the sort of widespread organized abandonment of buildings. And so like we in the tenant union do a lot of organizing all over Brooklyn. And we see these buildings that you can just and the building I live in too, you walk in and you can feel that it used to be beautiful. You can feel that there's something wonderful here. But it's just like buildings lose all of their staffs. Most of these big buildings in Brooklyn used to have full staffs. And we see, I'm thinking about a couple buildings that I've helped organize in Flatbush where the sort of organized abandonment is just so stark. You see, we have these huge gardens that haven't been touched in years. This one complex in East Flatbush has all this beautiful public space that's been completely removed from access. So you really see the social reproduction of communities drained. And then on top of this, you see the pursuit of loopholes and often illegal deregulation and the implementation of draconian security and surveillance systems. So really bad stuff. Some more numbers. In the year 2000, there was about 1.4 million rent stabilized units in New York City. Between 2000 and 2007, before the financial crisis, New York City lost 345,000 rent stabilized apartments. So in this period, private equity was just running wild, evicting people, dispossessing people, and usually illegally deregulating units. There's this landlord lawyer, her name is Michelle Itkowitz. She's goofy, but she represents landlords and sometimes tenants in housing court, but she does have this estimate that there are 250,000 illegally deregulated units in New York City. She says about 75% of units that she sees are illegally deregulated. And so now in 2023, we have 857,000 rent stabilized units in the city. And we have 66,000 that are sitting empty. So these are what we know in tenant organizing as warehousing. So these are sort of the landlords operating as a class, holding these apartments hostage because of what they say are the harmful effects of the really big win that tenants had in 2019, which was huge, which we're going to get into. This is the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which I think the sort of coherence that came with the predatory equity narrative and the sort of building movement. One of the big results was in 2019, were these big laws that was emphatically won by the tenant movement. So these were grassroots tenant organizations, some nonprofits, tenant unions, really kicked ass and won really incredible protections, which really kind of dammed the river of illegal deregulation in the city. And huge win for the tenant movement. It really has, in some senses, slowed down the predation of private equity, particularly in rent stabilized apartment buildings. Rent stabilized apartment buildings are no longer really enticing to private equity. But at the same time, everyone in this room knows those wins are nowhere near sufficient. Even in rent stabilized units, our buildings are falling apart, our rents are still going up. And so now in response to that, what private equity is kind of doing is moving into single family homes in New York City. So moving into the market rate homes that were previously not as lucrative as the big multifamily rent stabilized buildings. This is kind of being called a new frontier. There's been a bunch of articles about this in the last couple of weeks. I don't know. And one of my more general critiques of some of the literature, kind of like what we were talking about, is oftentimes private equity and financialization are framed as these sort of newfangled, crazy new thing. But I really think we need to understand that it's just the profit motive at play. It's just, and like, hell yeah. And like, there's these articles about how private equity is allowing landlords from all different countries to sort of own single family homes in New York City now. But like Marx in volume 1 was writing about absentee landlords halfway around the world. So like this shit is not new whatsoever. Okay, like 2 more things. Some other conditions that are important that aren't related to private equity, but that private equity sort of benefits from is, and speaks to the more generalized class struggle conditions of tenancy and housing in New York City, are like the skeletal regulations and regulatory oversight of housing in New York City. What's up, comrades? We have rights that are in name only, so like right to counsel, which is a really important right that guarantees tenants representation in housing court. It was a law that was won. It's not enforced whatsoever because all of the legal aid and legal service nonprofits are up to their neck in cases. Recently found out that the Department of Building is facing a massive shortage of inspectors, and they just removed 117 vacant positions that they were hiring for. They've lost over 100 staffers since the pandemic. And so like a lot of the regulations, and this is one thing that really makes me think so much about Kim's work and Kim's book, Fear City. A lot of the wins that we've won historically, because so many of the regulations in the city that could be enforced have been won by radical and militant tenant organizing historically, but so many of these wins, because of, I think, the dwindling of the organized working class in the city, just become paper and unenforceable, and like sometimes just like frustrations. Okay, the very last thing maybe to talk about at the moment is the private equity and venture capital's role in real estate has led to this other sort of grotesque, perverse emergence of a thing called prop tech or platform real estate. And this is sort of like the marriage of sort of Silicon Valley technology and just like gross old school landlordism. And there's like, in my understanding, there's like 3 different types or valences of prop tech. The first one is security and surveillance systems. So something that myself and my comrades in the tenant union are researching right now is the advent of prop tech security surveillance systems in New York City that have roots in the Israeli and Zionist occupation of Palestine. So like these startups in Israel that are started by former IDF soldiers who worked in those units surveilling Palestinians create companies that are very soon after creating like eye scanners for apartment buildings in Brooklyn, like really crazy pipeline. The second sort of valence of prop tech is management platforms. So something we've seen in the tenant union a lot is if you have all of a sudden a new payment portal that also simultaneously reports your rent balance to credit reporting agencies, this is prop tech. This shit is awful. Another management platform is the sort of algorithmic rent setting technologies, which help landlords set the optimal rent. But really similarly to, I don't know if people read that really grotesque article about the AI systems in Israel that have facilitated the genocide. Similarly to that, these algorithms, they don't actually set an optimal rent. They just allow landlords and management companies to set rents that are higher than they're comfortable with, like humanly. It's terrifying. And then the very last form of prop tech, which there's a new player on the scene as of like the last few days, is fractional ownership. So I don't know if people saw, but Mark Benioff who's a ghoul, and Jeff Bezos, who's more of a ghoul. They've invested in this new company called Arrived. Arrived makes it so that anyone, anywhere in the world, with only $100 can invest in single-family rental real estate. So it's just like a timeshare, but with a big platform. But I think, and this brings it kind of back full circle, we need to understand this sort of advent, this process as a sort of tool of class domination. Because what this does is it, like, in the same way that pension plans that are imbricated into private equity firms, this is working people who are whose like wealth and assets and any value that they can hold on to are suddenly imbricated into the sort of predations of landlordism. And it's fucked up and we need to fight it at every turn. I think I have like a little more, but I think that's good for now.
It's fucked up and we need to fight it at every turn. All right, let's do my moderator role for a moment, and I'm going to ask you questions inspired by Comrade Alice, and we can open it up to the ask each other questions, and then we can open up to the audience. And you touched on this some, Holden, but now I always think about this. Bourdieu said something like that. Historical analysis is played by two extremes. One is nothing has changed at all, and the other is everything has changed and nothing is like it ever was before. And I don't know, as a historian, the occupational hazard is like nothing is like, so nothing is new under the sun, right? But you're also making the point that, yeah, these things like this, like the innovations, but it's just landlords and the guys. So how major a change is the private equity thing? Is it just the latest iteration of capitalism and it's the same old shit?
In the housing specific?
Well, like just we're talking about private equity, but the extraction of profit from very exploited populations, what it's all about, right? So just thinking about this, can we think about this as a revolutionary change or just, one day following the next?
I mean, my instinct is to say one day following the next. Yeah, I don't know. I've gotten pretty deep into the murky webs of financialization studies, Marxist financialization studies, and like there's a whole school of thought that understands financialization to be this sort of perversion of the capitalist mode of production, or even like a distinct new phase where, kind of like Kim was saying, no longer are we making real things, we're making fake things. But I'm sort of I don't know. I've gotten kind of deep into this one Greek Marxist. His name's John Milios. He's a freak. But he really argues against this on several fronts, and like one of them being that like material and immaterial production is not like a classic Marxist distinction. And on top of that, he's where I get the understanding of financialization of the class struggle technology on the behalf of capital. And so I think a lot of financialization studies puts the distinction between finance and industrial capital, and he sort of compels us, as clearly compelled me, to understand it between capital and labor. Hell yeah. And like understanding that financialization, just like the arrived sort of new landlord, fractional landlordship, like it's a class dominating tool in the sense that it like imbricates more of the working class into different like realms of capital, and by doing that sort of disintegrates working class cohesion.
It's like the 401k.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Kim, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think I would well, I guess maybe this is so I think being a historian can cut both ways, as you point out, and I think actually it is important to note the things that are different and new about private equity, and that in a way it's a little unsatisfying to just say it's all the same thing. And I mean, at one level of abstraction, yes, that is, of course, that is true. But I think it actually is important to look at the ways that private equity or other features of the contemporary landscape are different from what's come before. And the distinctive ways that they work maybe as tools of the ruling class, or these are like technologies or ways of doing things that are different and that set up a different set of relationships and connections. I think what's tricky is one wants to stay away, or like it's also, I think there is a tendency to describe finance in particular as though it operates in a very conspiratorial fashion. And a tendency to say finance is bad, finance is perverse, finance is unproductive, and it's distorting a virtuous, productive, small scale, maybe Midwestern capitalism of small, factories that are producing real things. And finance is coming in from outside and distorting that. And at its worst version, of course, we know that sort of goes into a conspiratorial thinking. You can leach into the kind of classic tropes of anti-Semitism. It doesn't help us to see the world as it really is, I think. And a lot of your work has always been about blurring or kind of looking at the ways that finance and real capitalism, productive capitalism, are completely intertwined with each other. So one doesn't want to kind of go that route with private equity either. But I think it is important, and I think it's not enough to say it's just the same thing all over again. There are things about the current situation that are different from the past, and it's the challenge is trying to isolate and describe and think clearly about what those really are and what private equity makes possible that are features that we see today that weren't the case in 1980 or 1950 or 1850 or whatever.
Again, in politicizing this, private equity, finance in general, can seem very abstract and incomprehensible to a lot of people. And the class analysis clarifies, but all these institutional complications make it hard sometimes to think clearly about it. So is there a way to politicize the issue of private equity as a site of class struggle? Or is it best just to focus on things like landlords, tenants, nursing homes, specificities of it? Or is there a way to think of it generally as something that needs to be fought? I read some of one of the books you reviewed, Lewis, actually. And it's got this moment where it's like, how can we reform this? I mean, it sounds like almost like Arundhati Roy. A new world is being if we just think of it, like, okay, yeah. But I don't know, is it possible to reform this in isolation? Is it just the whole goddamn rotten system that needs to come down? And how do we think about it politically, in the practical political things? I'm asking the question.
Well, I think I guess there are two. This is maybe a little. I think that there are a lot of reasons to try to approach the. So I think first of all, trying to public education projects about what private equity is, how it works, I think are immensely helpful to people, and I think trying as much as possible to try to make it seem as though this is a world that actual people created or benefiting from. Trying to explain how private equity functions is itself a clarifying political act. I guess I would point to two things, and this is drawn partly from that Baloo book, and he has a very long list of possible reforms, but there were two that leapt out at me as more immediately pragmatic things to think about. And the first is just recognizing that a lot of the private equity the way that private equity functions is very reliant on public policy in many ways. So, for example, the actual profits that private equity investors can command are taxed at capital gains rates rather than interest, and rather than as income taxes, and are therefore a lot lower than what they would otherwise be. Now that's kind of a narrow point and might be narrow.
But when Obama suggested raising that tax,
right.
Steve Schwarzman compared it to the Nazi invasion of Poland.
Right. So I think, and I you know, it's a narrow thing, but doing things that actually would make it somewhat more difficult for these, and that highlight the dependence of the massive profits that these individuals and investors and firms earn, but they really rely upon an infrastructure, a public infrastructure. That's one thing. I think the other thing is that focusing, it is really striking how important the public sector unions and also university endowments have been. The large private university endowments have played a very major role in the expansion of private equity and also in its legitimation. And I think it's kind of, you know, these are institutions that are supposed to have some other social benefit. So calling out that contradiction and just asking, why is it that you are investing, so heavily in these practices, really, that are, that have a set of negative consequences for the employees of the companies that are purchased and for the people who are receiving the services. Why is it that you can do this? In the case of the public sector unions, you know, as you guys have written about, it's part of this larger question about funding these pension funds and the desperation of the pensions themselves and uncertainty about the broader political context that they operate in. So it goes back to all of that. And there's surely some other set of issues, you know, that are in a totally different state with the universities. But
yeah, I actually had a long section, which I deleted for one thing, about David Swenson, who was the manager of Yale's investment fund from 1985 till he died in 2021. And he really was the innovator in putting a lot of Yale's money into private equity and succeeded tremendously. And then his proteges went off to other elite institutions that did very similar things. But Swenson himself was pretty honest about saying, don't try this at home. This only works if you're really, really rich and sophisticated like me. And other universities have tried it and not done so well. And there's a great table in Piketty's Capital of the 21st Century in which he ranks university endowments by their size and returns. And there's a perfect correlation between size and return. Like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton are up there in a class by themselves, and then as you go down, and then you get to the $100 million endowments, and they're barely paying the bills. So there's some kind of. I once talked to a Yale union analyst, and what are the chances that their alumni are throwing in sweet deals? These are very large returns. He said we always thought that we could never prove it. From that aside, it's really very much insider's game. It's like an insider elitist game, and Swenson really played a big role in legitimating and funding these characters. And Yale was a university with a hedge fund with a university attached sometimes as well. And I think these university endowments, they should just be liquidated. The proceeds given to public universities.
Oh yeah.
Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's, and not to be corny, but I think it all comes down to a question of democracy. And so I think as socialists, the imperative and the intervention we need to make is by building democracy from the ground up, because private equity is just all about control from the top down. And so specifically, my familiarity in housing and land and tenancy is what we need are actual building blocks of democracy, because, and part and parcel to my understanding that, and not to be super reductive, but that it is all just capitalism, means that we need to be building a democracy from the bottom up so that we can assume state power and then actually address the Yale hedge fund bullshit.
Roll out the guillotines.
Roll, whatever your method. And so I think as socialists, it's our job to sort of, or our responsibility to sort of study the history, not just of capitalism, but of socialist movements, to understand what building blocks we actually need to be building to actually build a socialism that could work. And something that my tenant union has been super interested in, and that tenant unions across the country are pretty interested in, is Venezuela's commune system, which is like a really beautiful intervention into socialist history. Chavez looked at past socialist projects and did his study and like understood that so many of them forgot about the role of social reproduction and home and like control over where and how you live and what you produce. And so in Venezuela, the experiment of communal socialism understands that socialism cannot be a top-down project. It has to have democracy echoing at every scale. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's sort of how we understand what we do in the tenant union is to intervene at points of class antagonism while simultaneously trying to build foundations of democracy that can work with, towards, and merge with like a socialist movement. And so I think if we're not thinking like actually with that trajectory, and it's going to take a long time, it'll take decades, but if we're not thinking with that trajectory, then like private equity, no matter what regulations you put in place, will find different avenues, because it's not like specific actors who you can like handcuff. This is a systemic pressure that will find any crease, and unless we actually build building blocks that can keep that shit out. That's
okay, I'm going to turn things over to Alice now. Here we'll come back to Q&A.
Okay, so we are gonna take some audience Q&A.
Great. I guess I was wondering a little bit, you talked about this a little bit, but how does a private equity company buy out another company that doesn't really want to be bought out? You said that some companies like didn't enjoy being bought out, but how does that work?
Well, that was big in the 80s, and it was public companies. So you're, Carl Icahn or somebody, and you find this, oh, here's a company, bad management, not making great profits. I'm going to launch a big public relations campaign, raise some money, and buy up some of the shares. And then what you hope to do is find allies among the other shareholders who will then agree to press the vote out management or press the existing management to resign and pass along to a new owner. It didn't always work. Sometimes just the threat of a takeover is enough, though, to displace the existing management. But anybody can buy the shares, and if you accumulate a fairly large number, it doesn't have to be 51%. If you accumulate a large number, you can really challenge the direction of the company. With a completely private company, it's impossible unless you go in there with a gun and hold it up. But other than that, which they did in the 19th century.
At other points, I think a lot of private equity firms, at least in their public relations materials today, emphasize that they don't really do that kind of hostile takeover, and so
they're really pretty much a thing of
yeah, they find owners who want to sell to them, and for I guess I think that they'll get a good deal out of doing so.
Could you guys try to restate the question a little bit before you answer?
Yeah.
Thank you, just for audio. Thanks.
That was the question I wrote down. I was like, why are they being bought?
Hello, comrades.
Alright.
Yeah, so bringing it back to class struggle, organizing conversations, political education 101. So my family, I'm from Los Angeles. I have 5 aunts. All of them are public school teachers. And so they are very proud and reliant of their, teachers union and their pension, which is controlled by CalPERS, which is the California Public Employees Retirement System. Yeah, okay. And so CalPERS, their pension grows because they give billions of assets and funds to private equity investors in order to grow those funds out. And so just wondering, like, what would the conversation be like? Say we're at Thanksgiving, which was happening recently, and like trying to have a conversation about like, you know, why private equity is bad, but also kind of like they do understand that if it wasn't for private equity right now, and because they're not presenting any alternatives, that their pension wouldn't grow, they wouldn't have a pension, and they wouldn't be able to retire at age 50, which they can do. Which is my aunt just turned 50, she's retiring. She's been a public school teacher for 30 years. Oh, yeah. So yeah, like, well, how would that conversation go? I'm wondering.
Yeah,
what are the alternatives?
The question was like, people whose pensions depend on this sort of thing. How do you approach that? How do you talk to them? How do you persuade them? Well, you know, CalPERS is an interesting case because they were really big in the 90s. Shareholder revolution struggle. So they would regularly draw up lists of target firms, 10 firms that were underperforming, and then that would draw all the takeover artists, and you know. So this was, it's kind of the transition from the bad boys of the 80s into the more respectable moves of the 90s and beyond. And I once interviewed the general counsel of CalPERS, and I said, how do you justify using the funds of public sector workers to finance what is a very anti-worker agenda? And he said, no, we don't think about that. We only care about the returns. So, I mean, you have to, if you're going to convince people, you're going to have to convince them that it's, you know, well, I'm sure they love their pensions and it's really nice to be able to retire at 50. Most people can't do that. Yeah. You're living in this sort of private welfare state. And the thing we need is not to have pension funds used to mobilize a very anti-worker agenda, but then maybe we shouldn't have pension funds at all. That would expand in public pension systems where everybody gets a decent retirement income. And you know, and unions are really often quite bad on this issue. They want to protect their private welfare states. It's like health insurance too. A lot of unions don't want a public health insurance system for the same reason. So that's bad. And you know, we have to persuade people that while it may be good for them personally, it's really not good for everyone else in society as a whole.
Yeah, thank you.
But if you want to Thanksgiving, go for it.
I was really curious, how many people are employed by private equity companies? The reason I ask is because in New York City, there is a high employment of different financial companies that are trying to get
for the firms themselves, rather than for the companies that the private equity firms own. That's a good question. I don't know how many, but my guess is that actually the number of people who are working for the private equity funds themselves is not that large. I mean, they're just, but I don't know exactly how many.
Yeah, I don't know how many exactly either, but you know, as I said, Blackstone has 250 working in a private equity fund, and they manage, you know, scores of billions of dollars. So I would, you know, just extrapolating from Blackstone, I would say it's nationally it'd be hard to get to 1 million. Even.
Yeah. So I guess the beginning of your speech, like in particular, you briefly mentioned competition as like an inappropriate lens for viewing and assessing private equity. And I guess for transparency, I work at the antitrust division at the DOJ. This is where I was introduced to that book. And I'm just curious, like, I'm a little bit disillusioned with antitrust a little bit, not just because of the tepidness of like the laws that we have, the vagueness of it, but also just the judicial makeup of the federal, you know, of like federal judges seems to be so bent towards, you know, private equity. And so I'm curious, can you like expand upon that critique a little bit? And do you see any sort of competition law or antitrust laws having a temporary sort of measure in reining in, I guess, that consolidation, economic consolidation?
The question was, what should we think about competition and antitrust? I'm against. I think this liberal obsession now, Elizabeth Warren and all these people who are obsessed with antitrust. It's a dream of an old world of small business and competition, and it's bad. You know, we as socialists we should be believing in cooperation. There was a, when JP Morgan died, the end of Vincent Ross's book, by Morgan, he quotes this, he doesn't name who it was, but some Atlanta socialist was saying, many people would criticize what Morgan did, but not socialists, because we think competition is a bad thing. And we want to end competition. We just don't want it. And when I said we don't want it, run with competition ended by the likes of JP Morgan, but we want solidarity and cooperation. And the idea of like antitrust and breaking things up and having more competitive markets is just the opposite of that. So and it's a bad choice between capitalist monopoly and capitalist anti-monopoly. You know, we need to have some kind of socialist cooperative monopoly.
What the Trumps are saying.
I guess I appreciated the putting in the context that even though private equity doesn't own a huge proportion of the rent stabilized house stock, that their practices have become very viral. And I'm wondering though that because we understand like on the endowment situation, and it's sort of a thing where unless you're big enough and you know what you're doing, a lot of times those kinds of practices can be detrimental to a business. So I'm wondering if you've seen landlords sort of almost shoot themselves in the foot by trying to act like the big boys, or if that's something, and if that's something that's happening more widely in the corporate world, like trying to take on these practices, if that virality is also a problem.
Absolutely.
You should repeat the question.
Oh, the question is if the virality of private equities sort of practices and rental management compels certain small potatoes landlords to shoot themselves in the foot. And I would say absolutely. We see landlords, small landlords across New York City trying to get away with shit that they have no business trying to get away with. So many of the illegal deregulations that we see are just like so lazy and fraudulent that it's like a really helpful organizing tool. But I think even more than like just the virality of practices, I think it's also like just like a permission also for landlords to sort of just withdraw, abandon their buildings. So that is like a little bit less shooting themselves in the foot, because it really just does allow them to not tend to anything. But the terrible fraudulent sort of deregulation and like attempts at evicting people, we see so much just really awful, lazy, blatantly sort of fraudulent attempts at that. And it's good for us, I guess, in some sense, because when we do encounter it, we can fight back pretty effectively. It's bad on the whole because there's millions of tenants in the city and not many of them are organized. And so a lot of them, when presented with a really phony looking eviction notice, will just get the hell out. Yeah, I don't know. I think tenants, similarly to, I think, something that was said earlier about people just being grateful for having a job. So many tenants in the city are just grateful to have an apartment. And that's the sort of mindset that we as kind of unionists and socialists are trying to transcend.
Wow. No, New York Magazine had an article a couple of years ago about civic landlords who had all these enforcers, you're buildings out in Bed-Stuy. I mean, you just real small potatoes, you know, New York real estate circles, but yeah, I think I don't think these guys needed to learn from private equity how to hire muscle men to kick it.
Yeah, we see a lot of landlords like filling vacant apartments with like agents of their own just to harass people.
Back in the 80s, they used to rent to the crack addicts.
Yeah, or burn them down.
Yeah, that was more 70s.
Yeah,
the 80s, they were moving towards more constructive.
So I'm about to join one of those lucky 12 million, the 8% of employees that work for private equity firms. Really excited about it. You know, they've told us like business as usual, no layoffs, we're not going to flip it, but you know, regardless of their plans, insert it anywhere. You know, without getting into the specifics of my own workplace here, you know,
You're not an investor.
I'm not an investor. I'm a worker. Yeah, so do you think that there are particular opportunities when workers are trying to organize against their private equity employer? Do you think there are specific difficulties? I don't know. What do you think in general? Not giving me specific advice.
Well, I would imagine that it would actually be a pretty, oh yeah, so the question is how do you, if you work, as some of us may, for companies that are being bought by private equity funds, does this create obstacles or opportunities or both for workplace organizing? I mean, I guess as an optimist, I would probably say it creates certain opportunities because I think it would, I think first of all, you can be on a careful watch for any changes in the workplace or any changes in terms of the either other supplies or staffing and all of it. And you might look for changes that are coming about in company over the next year or so. And I think people may be especially open to seeing those as coming as a result of this new ownership structure and whatever loyalties people have to the, I don't know, the company or the existing managers would have to be somewhat attenuated by that new situation. So I think it might actually be, you know, while it might create actual problems in the workplace, it ought to create certain, it's a different narrative for organizing, depending on the particulars of the situation, of course. I mean,
what was the ownership structure before?
We're a small company within a larger private company, and a portion of it is being split off. So we're still going to be a smaller part of it, but we're going to be part of this private equity.
Well,
They got a toilet.
I mean, this is something which I don't know whether anybody has done this, but I think another interesting possibility might be to look for other companies that are owned by the private equity fund and a certain kind of communication between the different parts of the entities owned by the fund might be just another way of thinking about the question. So.
Well, in that this line of question, we already touched on it a little bit, but can you go down a little bit on how a lot of these companies are serving more vulnerable populations who are less likely to organize? When we talk about healthcare and tenants, how private equity operates on the board.
nursing home presence.
Yeah. Right. Well, that was a theme that came out of, I guess, these two books in particular. Both of the authors really emphasize a lot of private equity funds are interested in buying companies that seem to have pretty vulnerable client bases as the ultimate customers. So, and people who might not be able to effectively challenge reductions in services, for example, at a nursing home. Another interesting, another theme was that these were companies that often have income streams that come from the government or from Medicare or other sources of public funds ultimately. And so, you know, it's another aspect of the private equity company benefiting from or turning certain public resources for itself. And the third thing is, I think this came up especially in the Baloo book, was the idea of the private equity funds sometimes encouraging to separate or like sort of legal, the sort of subdivision of the companies that they purchase into different legal units, partly to try to minimize the assets that would be available to any particular entity in the event of a lawsuit. Mm-hmm. So, and Baloo really presents this as a pretty intentional strategy on the part of the private equity funds. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you know, these there's a certain
percent of the population that doesn't believe in capitalism. They believe in greed. They believe in the secret hand, and profitability is the main thing. And anybody who proceeds down any road other than that is just a crunchy liberal, and get them out of the way. And that's always been an idea in America, but I think it's much more prevalent and more strongly held now amongst a certain section of the population, you know, those, the Trumpists, and we've seen some things happen in the past 5 years that enforces this. Giant companies coming out of nowhere because they had an algorithm, crypto coins, all these kinds of things where what we have to do is push aside the things that are keeping the fight for greed and the rapaciousness of capital, and then everything will be fine. Now, in the past, you had to be a capitalist to do this, but now the idea is all you have to have is that idea to do this. You have to have that understanding, and so there's a broad population of people sitting in their basements on their computers, trying to find ways to do that. And I think that's part of what's going on here. To me, you know, private equity is similar to fund funds were 30 years ago to companies going private and the public and the private. I think Reynolds, the tobacco company, did that 5 or 6 times. So they were going to do things so they wouldn't be public anymore, and they would do a bunch of evil things and then go public again. And you see this again and again. But I think we have to fight against that idea, that strain in American thinking, because it's much more prevalent and much more widely held now than I think ever. And I don't know how to do that. But I think we need to be a group that does that, that confronts that idea at its very core, and do that as part of our everyday political work. Because I think, to a certain extent, that's a piece that's missing in how we do the work.
Well, I would just say, though, you know, now that these attitudes seem less prevalent, these pro-capitalist attitudes seem less prevalent now than they did 30 years ago. I remember it's like calling yourself a socialist in 1995 was like, you know, just calling yourself a freak and a weirdo. And you're either responsible for the gulag or just have your head so far in the cloud you don't have to talk about it. So I don't feel that way anymore, and it's really funny that way. So there has been some progress.
Yeah, I think part of the answer to the sort of ideological struggles we have to build sort of containers in which that ideological struggle can take place. Like, we can't just have that argument in the abstract, even though having propaganda and sort of popular media figures is important. But I think we actually need to have containers and infrastructure and organization where we can have these struggles with our neighbors, with our coworkers. And I think we don't necessarily win the ideological struggle by just having the better argument or like crafting the right statement. But I think, and again, this is what we practice in the tenant union. We love it. You win these ideological struggles by actually engaging in struggle with your neighbors, with your coworkers, and showing them and participating with them and showing them that they can be protagonists in transforming conditions. And I think we can't have these ideological struggles in the abstract or in vacuums or even on like panels. They need to be like actually embedded into political and social praxis.
Oh yeah. Well, the tenant world is really good place for that to happen, because housing is a fundamental need, and the conflict becomes really, really clear. Yeah. And like, what do you mean? I'm paying all this money so that house I could live, you know, in luxury 100 miles away from you. You know, it's just it all, it's like almost scissors, it's clarity.
Thinking about sort of all these different instances of private equity and the way that it's damaging to workers and the way that it was leveraged in the form of like public sector pensions, what sort of opportunities do you guys see for like inter-union organizing, I think, against private equity, and any difficulties or like untapped areas that you thought about in that realm?
The question was what, how can unions be invested in the struggle against private equity? There's a union-funded group, whose name now escapes me, that, or part of the union-funded group that is fighting private equity. But their concern is mainly fees. The fees they charge the pension funds. They're not really very good. So, you know, I'm not sure there's a whole lot going on there. Maybe that could change, but I think what I see out of it is that actually existing unions is not encouraging.
There is this group which has a lot of good materials about private equity. I think it's called the Private Equity, is it the Stakeholder Project?
Yeah, something like that.
So they actually did have more reporting on, yeah, it might be, I'm actually not sure who or what is the founder, or who's backing this organization, but it works a bit like it's kind of a think tank research group. But it does actually generate a lot of reports which are helpful about, which aren't just focused on the kind of the fees or whatever internal things, but on the social impact of private equity owned companies and what the private equity funds are doing to the companies they purchase. And actually they've done a lot of stuff about climate and private equity. And so, so I think that actually that, I mean, anyway, it's just a resource to check out. And yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems with the private with there should be, again, ways for unions to take the story of private equity and use it in organizing. I don't know actually of examples of union organizing campaigns at private equity owned companies, but that would be something interesting to look at. But I think one of the problems is that the public sector unions are so heavily, the pensions are so invested that it's, I think that's a major fault line, and it's kind of probably an issue for the labor movement as a whole.
I learned from Blackstone's website the other day that they're actually very concerned about climate.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from all of you guys. It's been very broad, and hopefully this doesn't take us too far from the red. But Tim, you were talking about defense and like national security failures in private equity. I wonder if people would talk about that.
Actually, what I meant was more not so much private equity and defense, but more just the question of can the ruling elite formulate a coherent set of policies and a program for the nation as a whole, and suggesting that there's some way in which, even if you take the kind of narrow question, like even if you think of American foreign policy interests in a very narrow way, at this moment it seems like there's profound incoherence in ruling circles about how to do that. So that wasn't really so much about private equity, just that there's the similar, there's something the very privately oriented and self-interested nature of private equity companies, and they're somewhat the somewhat anti-social qualities that this management practice embodies, that it mirrors something of broader incoherence. So that was more what I meant than anything about the particular companies.
Speaking of national security, here's a fun fact. The CIA has a venture capital arm. Venture capital is a specific form of private equity, called Incutel, I think it's, I don't know, I'm sure that's not. But they, among other things, provided startup funds for Peter Thiel's surveillance firm, Palantir. Yeah.
Need some of that money then.
Well, Teal's giving out a lot of money. Didn't like it.
Make a podcast.
Final thing. And if you have others, please stick around after him.
I have a question about these vacant office buildings and with all that space, right, in many states of housing. So obviously that's like a place we could look, if we could deregulate office buildings and make them suitable for housing, right? And it's my understanding that the owners of these office buildings are not selling because if they were to start selling these buildings, it would show how little value they have. And so they're holding on to them, they're forcing them to pay it with really high value. And this is, I heard on the radio. But it just seems like there might be like an opportunity there for us, like to, I don't know, we haven't position the building things, but like it just seems like we need space for people to live, the private equity moving into single family homes, and the socialists moving to these office buildings and making the housing. And is there an opening there, or has that been explored at all?
I don't know about any. Question was regarding the empty office buildings, office space, and how the owners of these offices are not selling them because they don't want to expose how valueless they are. And the question was if there's any movement or possibility of sort of, as socialists, taking these over, converting them to housing. And I don't know if there's any actual or imminent sort of projects, but I do know that any sort of substantial socialist project in this country will need to use eminent domain pretty profusely. I think eminent domain will be once we assume state power, will be one of the tools that we use to reclaim land. But as for like happening now, I don't know. It would be great.
New York does have the most developer-friendly eminent domain law in the country. So in other places, you have to show some sort of social benefit for seeking property, but in New York, it's just like, we want it. It's ours.
Oh yeah.
Please, a round of applause for our panelists. I'm going away. If they made you excited and hungry for more, please join DSA and become a juice tank. If you want political education, we have many more events. Tomorrow we are starting our Walter Rodney reading group from 1 to 3. If you're interested, just find one of us and we'll get you involved. It's a 6-week reading group hosted by me. And in the spring, we are starting our Socialists of New York City spring night school. So we will be meeting here every other Tuesday, starting February 13th. So students sign up and come find one of us if you want to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.